Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be taking a look at Paco Roca's Twists of Fate. This is from Frantic Graphics' ongoing collection of Paco Roca's work. I'm really glad they're doing this, making this like Paco Roca library. I've enjoyed everything that I've read of his that they've put out. There was one that came out last year that was just like auto-bio journal comics that I didn't really enjoy because it was that typical just cartoonist being a cartoonist type of thing. But other than that, I've really enjoyed everything that I've read from Paco Roca. I think I've got all the stuff that they've put out now. He's this very kind of staunchly Spanish artist, which I like that he's always very much invested in all things Spain. This book here is researching like a very important kind of famous, infamous World War II hero from a Spanish battalion. He's got other books that are, autobiographical or biographical that deal with being Spanish, the political, real-world situations in Spain, translations of famous books. I just feel like he's really committed to recording things that have a legitimate like saturation in the history and flavor of the country, from a broad viewpoint of many years, and I appreciate that as a whole project for a creator. This book's particularly interesting in that it gives a different look at World War II. Fantagraphics is trying to sell this as like the Spanish Mouse. It kind of format works the same, but I don't think it has like the same potency as Mouse, even though it's a really good, interesting book. So this starts on March 28th, 1939 at the port of Alicante, and you're meeting the main character here, Miguel Ruiz. He is waiting for a boat, and he's gonna flee Spain as World War II kind of moves in and hits Spain. He has to flee, and he goes on to become a very famous freedom fighter through many phases of the war. Because it is a real biography of a real person that included a lot of interviews, Paco Roca does the kind of typical thing following the Mouse format, where part of the book is also autobiographical, where it's actually showing him doing the research, interviewing the guy, getting to know his family. At first, I was a little put off by that in the book because Paco Roca's like kind of harassing the guy. Like, he's being told that the guy doesn't want to talk to him, he's avoiding you, he's not very talkative, he doesn't want to relive those times of his life. And so this self-centered autobiographical approach felt very gross to me in the beginning of this book. But as the book goes on, and I guess like in Mouse, Spiegelman is talking to his dad, and thematically, a big part of the theme of that book, like half of the book, is about how the trauma that Spiegelman's dad went through affected their family life and affected Spiegelman himself, and those are kind of tied in an interesting way. Obviously, in this book, Paco Roca is not directly connected to this person or this family, so that makes that self-insertion a little bit more like of a tenuous strategy for me. But as the book goes and he develops a relationship with Miguel, and you get to see kind of what happened to Miguel, it starts to become a pretty necessary part of the story that we get a lot of like Miguel in current times, and that's most easily shown by the interactions Paco had with him. So I get why, and I get why when you're doing these kind of biographies where you're talking to the actual people, or you're like Joe Sacco, you're going in and you're doing like actual reporting with real people, like it's just best to admit your own involvement with it. So in that sense, like, I get why this is a pretty standard thing for these type of comics. And it does play out to where I really enjoyed it in the rest of this book. As often with these books that record historical events, you also get a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's some pages where there's a good amount of maps going on showing movements of people throughout time and forces. This is showing people that fled Spain, that were exiled from Spain during World War II. At the end of the Spanish Civil War and Spanish exile, it shows all the people fleeing to which country they fled from. And then as the German Blitzkrieg happens, French armistice, German invasion of Russia, Allies arrive in Africa. You get to see how this diaspora of Spanish exiles moved around and how the different like little armies and forces kind of came together to create the groups that Miguel Ruiz was part of, and just how the general kind of movement of people happened in the war. It's very hard for me reading books like this. I have a pretty hard time with political stuff like this. I know I've made the comment on the channel before that I want like more truly adult works, and people have said, well, like a lot of the European comics are really adult. They deal with politics and war, and so that's all real serious real world stuff. And like, yeah, it is, but I also feel like it's very childish still. Like war just strikes me as the stupidest, craziest, silliest thing. And all of they did this and then they moved here and then she said that and then that pissed off so and so and that caused this reaction. It still all seems very like middle school rumor mill stuff to me. I just have a hard time with political minded books because it just seems like a bunch of stuff that shouldn't matter that people obsess about and treat as if it's important. And that's what's causing the problem. So I don't particularly see that as adult behavior or adult material. I just see it as stupid, childish adults behaving stupid and childishly and obsessed about the wrong thing. So the beginning of this book was hard for me because it's more about all of those who did this, who did that, what caused this. And I have a problem with that. But the book gets more interesting later on as we get to know Miguel himself and what he went through more clearly. I think that's the same thing like with Mouse, is when you can follow one person's struggle through it, then all of a sudden I can have that adult connection to it, And it's always impressive when you have someone like Miguel that went through this span of years that killed so many people, and he was involved in so many moments that so many people died in, and he made it, partly by luck, partly by his own ingenuity. It's always wild to hear those people's stories, and so I do like that. We also get, I also just recorded a video about my favorite thing is monsters, and was talking about the verbal logic of dehumanization. That shows up in this book quite a lot as well. Miguel is being asked a few times throughout the book, did he kill a lot of people? And he's always pretty like reluctant to talk about that, but he will say, like here he says, I don't know. I know that I only killed fascists and only in combat. So it's like he can't even admit to himself that he killed people. It's like they're fascists, so they're automatically bad. And not able to see how many of these soldiers were also just pawns in the war of some, larger corrupt people. So like in my favorite thing is Monsters book, there's a little bit of dialogue in there where they're talking about eggs getting stained by the beets around them, and that those eggs, the beet is like the evil, and those eggs just kind of picked up the evil because of the situation they're put in. Miguel can't see that because he obviously lived through fascism at its pinnacle and the awful things that it did, and he just knows how important it is to stop that force in the world. And so if you're a person that's being leveraged for that force, then you're not a person in his mind, you're just a fascist. And that's dangerous because that's exactly what the fascists and the Nazis were doing is, well, that's a Jew, it's okay to kill it, it's not a person, it's just a Jew. And that logic is, it's such a dangerous logic, and it's so easy for everyone on all sides to get caught into it, especially when you do have a very clearly morally corrupted political force in the world. It's really hard not to want to just immediately shut that down and stop it. But we do have to think about the cost of that dehumanizing language, even in those circumstances, because not everyone that's a part of that force is, someone who's actually a truly evil person. They're just stained by the bad eggs around them. And that shows up in many parts in the story here, where they could have taken someone prisoner and they just kill them. There's these moments like that. So I think there's a very powerful visualization here where they're in the trenches and they're fighting, and this guy's got a bayonet, they got to kill him, And Paco Roca does this really, really clever thing that in the soldier's mind, while he's killing this, this probably a kid on the other side as well, kids killing each other. He can't see him as the person. He's just stabbing this symbol, he's Nazi. And that little moment between them with no dialogue is such a potent and powerful moment because of that imagery that Paco Roca uses here to show the psychological state of having to dehumanize someone because of war. And I don't know, it's just like, it's so hard for me to read or watch or anything with war in it anymore because it just looks like the stupidest thing, the dumbest thing that we could be doing. I hate it. As Paco gets to know Miguel better, you start to learn more about Miguel and his family, and that this is where, seeing him as a person and that autobiographical aspect of Paco being in the book, talking to Miguel, becomes much more interesting. Also, Paco's able to bring him a book where someone that Miguel, a general that he had worked under, talks about him. And it says in the book, Miguel Campos, the type of born guerrilla who instinctively masters the art of war. And there's this like kind of opening up and flourishing of the Miguel character, and as his family and the people around him learn who he actually is. Like, he's never told anyone any of this stuff. He's changed his name, his last name, and has dissociated himself, and he doesn't think anyone remembers what he did. He thinks pretty much like Americans came in and took credit for French and Spanish were all also fighting in the war. All the Allied countries, and America kind of gets the credit. He feels overlooked, and he's finding out, that actually he is in books. He is part of history. People have recorded him. He's important, and that every awful thing he went through wasn't for nothing. I mean, he already knows that, but that his part in it was recorded is kind of helping him deal with it in some sense, and so that's really nice to see. You also just get some of the like economic impacts or like mechanisms that can happen in war. Like in this scene, they're trying to get some tanks or get some gas for their tanks, and they run into another country. I think they're running into the Americans, the Spanish forces running into Americans, and they're trying to trade for gasoline, and they're haggling a little bit about it, and they don't have enough money or resources or whatever, but they do have some German soldiers that they've captured, and they're able to trade those soldiers to the Americans. And when asked why, it's like, oh, we weren't supposed to do that, but it was a good way to negotiate with the Americans because they were given leave and things like that for capturing the Germans. So depending on the policies of the different armies, between the soldiers, there would be these kind of barter and trade things because different things had different values based on the different policies. The German soldiers had no value to the Spanish because they didn't get any, Spanish soldiers didn't get anything out of it, but they could trade it to the Americans for something they needed, because then the Americans could go get leave or whatever special accommodations they get for however many prisoners they catch. So it's that kind of specificity that's where it does get adult and interesting to me, is even though those are all stupid, arbitrary, systemic things, it does show like this higher level human behavior stuff about how things become valued, which is very interesting to me. Even though we often value stupid things and do stupid things with our value systems, I think that kind of granularity in Paco Roca's work is really nice. It really gives a good flavor of what it was actually like to be operating in those conditions, because those are what the conditions are. Roca's art is never super dynamic. He's very much like a stage play type of artist, which I like in his work. Like, it works very well for him. He's never doing anything terribly bombastic. For a war story, it does tame it down a little bit, which is maybe a good thing because you're seeing a lot of pretty intense things. But a sequence like this where they're busting into a house and chasing a guy and shooting him, you see that it plays out like not static. There's a lot of fluidity in the compositions and stuff, but definitely not these wild dynamic action sequences that you'd see in American books or some of the more sci-fi European books, things like that. It's very grounded, and I think that works really well for Paco Roca's writing style as well, that it's this very grounded, looking at these type of how systems work and things like that. I think his art perfectly matches that, and he's an impeccably clear storyteller as well. But that's about like as exciting as the imagery in the book gets for a war book. Some really intense moments here being described. They're looking in the top of the tank and they're saying it looks like jelly, like what they fed us in England. The explosion inside the tank pureed their bones. So just some of these things that a person like Miguel that went through, years upon years of being a soldier, obviously a really high level soldier, would have seen these intensely disgusting things. And just knowing that, these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, a lot of them seen these things. Again, it really gives you that kind of empathy for that generation that came back having seen all of this, and then they had to get right on with being like a dad in a normal American life, and the impact that that's had in all of the societies that were involved in this. You have this whole generation coming back having seen shit like pureed bones in a tank. It's hard not to see the ongoing impact of that in our world, and books like this are very good at exposing that. We come back again to the dehumanization. Here Paco's saying, were you hesitant to kill them in cold blood? It was war. In war, you never kill in cold blood. What I mean, it wasn't in combat. It was killing people without... It wasn't, no. They were fascists. To me, they weren't people with wives, with children. They were Nazis who wouldn't hesitate to do the same of us. Who do you think you are to come here and judge me? You come and stir shit up in order to write your book or whatever you're going to do. So again, those moral gray areas that war forces people into, and that look at what you have to do, like mentally. They weren't people with wives, with children. They were Nazis, and anytime you can say that, like they're a Nazi, and you're taking away their personhood, I think that's dangerous. Even if it is somebody as dangerous as a Nazi, I think we always got to keep in mind that empathetic view of like, this is a person with a child and a wife and this history in their country. And like, if we can understand the motivations, and have some faith that like Hitler might have been evil and sick and twisted, and some of the high level people might, but the low level people, that are stuck in circumstance, even though they're part of a bad machine, they themselves may not be so bad. There might be other ways of approaching this, but obviously for the sake of war, we just dehumanize, and that's a Nazi, kill it. And they're talking here about, like taking people prisoner versus just killing them and getting rid of them, and they just kill people because that's like the easier solution. And also, you got to stop the fascists. And then Miguel like expands upon that and says, honestly, anyone who understood clearly what Nazism represented acted the way we did. Of course, we had doubts in some of those moments. And as time has gone by and the rage and desire for revenge passed, I've regretted some things. But I would do them again if defeating fascism depended on it. So even like all these years later, that regret has crept in. He started to think about these people as like, hey, that was someone who had wife and kids, but I have no regrets. I would do it again. Like that force itself as a force of evil in the world was evil enough that we had to stop it. It's unfortunate though that like that had to come at the expense of like, hey, look, these guys didn't need to be killed. And Paco goes on to show a couple of them that didn't get killed, and the information they were to give, and basically the benefit of not killing the couple soldiers that didn't get killed versus taking them out in the field and killing them. So there's still like this tension in the book where that's like an unresolved argument. I think in Paco Roca's mind is, like he understands what Miguel's saying, like Nazism had to be stopped, like no doubt that had to be stopped, but also like to do that, he had to delve into some of the same dehumanizing logic that the Nazis were applying to the Jews that allowed them to gas them and stuff like that. So just really showing the complexities of a situation this awful when our world leaders take us into something that awful. It puts all of the rest of us into these, morally impossible to resolve areas. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that comes across in this book. And in my favorite thing is Monsters, kind of reading these pretty much back to back. It was something that made itself very apparent to me, that we're kind of stuck in these situations and there really is no great answer. As we near the end of the book, we're coming up to the liberation of Paris, and they're talking about why we wanted to make sure that certain people got in and were the ones to liberate Paris before others got in. And Paco Roca says, I heard that one of de Gaulle's secret reasons was that he didn't want the communists, who were the majority of the insurgents, to get the glory for liberating Paris. So we wanted to make sure that the Allies got in there and liberated Paris. Otherwise, it would give communism a leg up in the world post-World War II. So another one of these big things where you're seeing the stupidity of the world at large push a lot of people into these situations. The motivations, like, yeah, we want to beat the Nazis, but there's also like the Allies and the communists, basically democracy and socialism are still battling it out as well, like within the context of this other battle versus the fascists and the Nazis, to basically see who gets to claim the credit as the heroes of the war, because those would be the people that would have the political power afterwards. So you see all of this, stuff cycling around on the table there as strategies are being planned. It's more than just winning the war against the Nazis. And you start to learn that Miguel was part of the group that was the part of the first Allied people. It was like his very small group snuck into Paris at night to let the revolutionaries know, hold on, there's a bigger force coming in by the morning. And just to think about like what an intense moment that would be to, and historically also looking back on that, to know that you were part of that just had to be one of the wildest moments in life. Some really cool stuff here as they show these characters sneaking in, how they had to sneak past in their military gear. They got tanks and jeeps, but they had to basically take this sneaky route through Paris to avoid being seen, to meet up with the insurgents that were there. So some really cool, more playful composition than you would normally get from Paco Roca with this map going like this, but he does it very well, and I really like the insertion of it. And then here, as we get towards the end of the book and we see the actual liberation of Paris, where they're walking through the streets afterwards, letting the people know like Paris is free again, I cannot fathom the emotional state that it would be like after 5, 6, however long, many years of war. I think 6, 7 years that Miguel has been at war, to be part of a moment like this has to be absolutely totally nuts. And they're even being very careful about not flying any flags or anything like that, because they want to make sure that like no message is put out wrong, like, we're not coming in and taking over. He says nothing political today, just celebration. And yeah, I cannot imagine the mix of emotions that must go into that. There's also some like personal stuff running through the book here about, how Miguel got out of the army, how he led the rest of his life that I haven't covered. I'm covering the kind of pretty straightforward part of his path through the war, but the more personal elements that make the book even more engaging, I pretty much stay totally away from. So you could still go out and read this book, and there's a whole other like set of sub stories and plots and emotional things that play out in this that are really awesome. And those are the things that I think always matter to me the most, are the that come down to the personal level. Because like I said, for me, the political stuff is all still just like adults that haven't grown up and they're still stuck in junior high, he said, she said, best friends fighting, all that kind of bullshit. Like, war is very childish, but the adult aspect of all of this comes in the psychological impacts on people and how people live their life afterward and how people cope. Like, that's where wisdom comes from, a life lived, the personal stuff. And so I think Paco Roca does a very, very good job showing how, and this carries into all of his books. This is why I find him to be such a compelling cartoonist and writer, is he's always able to intermix the two, the personal and the political. And I've always hated the saying that the personal is political. I feel that it should be flipped the other way, where the personal should be the primary thing, and politics should always be in the service of the personal. But here, like in all cases, the personal is always put to service of the stupid political. And I think Paco Roca has made that point several times in many, many works, but most clearly in this. So this is a really phenomenal book, and I think a real masterpiece. And I would encourage anyone to read this and the rest of Roca's work. The Exile by Eric Creek is a gorgeously illustrated Viking saga of revenge. Eric Creek calls it his Viking Western. It's about a guy who's been away on the warpath and is returning home to some family troubles that have to be resolved. And this is told in just this amazing, like, kind of 3-color art style that looks like old woodblock cuts or something. It's absolutely gorgeous book that you've got to pick up.